Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to build a rattan storage console. This was only the second commission piece I'd ever built, and I ended up building two pieces that went side by side. The record player console will be in a separate video. The customer requested that the two sliding doors would be secured with a child-proof latch. I looked around for something that would be suitable and could not find anything, so I ended up having to build that myself. And you'll see that later in the video. You see me here just breaking down the sheets of plywood. This is 18mm birch plywood and it has a blackbutt veneer. Blackbutt is a type of eucalyptus. Next I need to cut all the panels to length, and so this was done using the crosscut sled, as you can see here. Quite a long piece that I'm cutting in half, so I had to be pretty careful with this one. You'll see I've used blue painter's tape here on the veneer plywood. That's just to protect the veneer from splitting when it goes through the table saw. The main carcass of the cabinet is going to be put together using miter joints and dominoes. So here I'm just doing a 45-degree cut, and this will be for each of the four corners. I finally managed to get my hands on a Festool domino. This was a game-changing tool in terms of putting together cabinetry and joinery. Looking forward to using it more in future projects. Using a shelf pin drilling jig here, that allows me to keep the spacing between all of the different shelf pins on both sides of the cabinet consistent. Here I'm milling and planing the pieces that will make up the sliding doors, and I'm just using the crosscut sled here to cut those to length. You might notice there's a little bit of burn here from the table saw blade on the back of the doors. This is not going to be visible in the end product, so I didn't end up going and fixing it. Definitely could have been avoided by pushing the pieces through in a different way, but for next time I will be a little bit more careful. I'm using the router here just to create some tracks for the sliding doors to sit in. And I'm using the router's edge guide here. That just allows me to set the depth of those tracks consistently across the top and the bottom of the panels. I probably could have put that domino in a slightly different position. This didn't end up being a problem, but it was very close to running into an issue here. Now, I forgot to record it, but the rattan was soaked for about 30 minutes in just some warm water. That allows it to stretch a little bit easier, and when it dries, it actually tightens itself, so you don't have to be too careful with the overall stretching process. And if you're doing this with a stapler, just make sure you don't use a PSI that's too high, or you'll actually cut through the rattan with the staples. You'll see here that I've started work on the childproof doors. What I'm doing now is drilling a hole down vertically through the door, and that will have a spring-loaded dowel that will actually allow the door to sort of catch into a recess that's in the tracks. I'm using a handheld router here just to create a little notch where the screw that will sit in the dowel can move up and down. Now I ended up going with a different handle to this, but this just gives you an indication of how the door will function. It's very pleasing to use, and it works very well. in the midst of a lockdown during this project, and so I wasn't even able to go to the local hardware store. Um, what I decided that I needed was a sort of sheath that would sit around the screw, and that would stop it from rocking side to side within that little slot that was cut. Um, I had some aluminium rod, and so I ended up using that, which I here had to first essentially mill down to the right thickness to fit in the gap, and then ended up having to drill a hole through that. This was a bit of a tedious process, but ended up working really well. The handle for the latch was then just attached with epoxy, and that was attached over the top of the screw. For the project, I decided to use some edge banding on the front of the plywood rather than leaving the edge exposed like I have done previously. So this involved cutting a lot of thin strips using a thin rip jig on the table saw. And I used blackbutt timber here, so just the hardwood version of what the veneer was made of. And I just used a trim router just to clean up those edges using a flush cut bit. The table saw didn't do a perfect job, so I just had to use a plane just to fix that up. The whole piece was finished with 2 coats of a hard wax oil. I used a satin finish here. And just applied that using a non-abrasive Scotch Brite pad. Here I've started work on the base, and so that is just again using blackbutt timber. Cutting that firstly on the table saw, and then using the crosscut sled here to trim those pieces all to length. In the design of the 4 legs, there was a slight angle on each of those, and so I created a little jig here just using the staple gun, just to pass that through at the right angle on the table saw. I used the chamfer bit here on the router just to give a nice profile to the legs and the base. And I used some figure 8 connectors here just to allow for any movement in the wood. So these were just attached to the top side of the base and then screwed in through the plywood. There was one last thing I wanted to do, and that was to insert a thin strip of the hardwood into those tracks. They were a little bit unsightly with the visible plywood in there. And there was also a little gap that I needed to fix as well. So I hope you enjoyed that build, and on to the next one.